Good afternoon. My name's Beth Beasley, and I'm a principal in the Guidance and Support Group here at the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants. It's my pleasure to welcome you today. We have over 1,800 registrants for today's session on board recruitment, development, and assessment in not-for-profit organizations. Before we get started, we just wanted to let you know you can submit questions at any time during the presentation by typing them into the bottom right of your screen where it says Ask a Question and clicking Send. We may address some questions as they come in during the webinar, and there'll also be a dedicated question and answer session at the end of our time today. Today's webinar is sponsored by Robert Half Finance and Accounting. Robert Half International is the first and largest specialized staffing firm with over 360 offices worldwide, including 22 locations across Canada. The company has 7 divisions, including Account Temps, Robert Half Finance and Accounting, and Robert Half Management Resources for temporary, full-time, and project professionals, respectively, in the fields of accounting and finance. Ingrid Morse is a recruiting manager in the Vancouver office of Robert Half Finance and Accounting. She's responsible for interviewing and mentoring job seekers, liaising with clients about their full-time hiring needs, and networking with professional associations throughout Vancouver and the surrounding area. She will introduce today's speakers.
Thank you, Beth. The speaker for today's webinar is Richard LeBlanc, an Associate Professor of Law, Governance, and Ethics at York University in Toronto. His research and professional activities are lodged in Board of Director Effectiveness. He assesses and advises boards of significant public companies, including those that have won peer recognition awards for their governance practices and disclosure. He has also assessed and advised boards in the not-for-profit and governmental sectors. The recruitment, education, and assessment of individual directors, including their skills, competencies, and behaviors, are a key feature of Richard's research expertise. Governments, regulators, industry, and shareholder associations have drawn on his expertise and work. Richard has received awards for his teaching and corporate governance research and publishes in practitioner as well as academic outlets. He possesses extensive knowledge of current and emerging best global governance practices and has been called upon by the media, boards, and industry associations to provide his independent views on board and individual director effectiveness. And now I will turn it over to you, Richard.
Thanks very much, Ingrid. Richard is the lead author of the document on which the webinar today is based, as well as an award-winning professor, and I'm thrilled to have him with us. And just before I turn it over to him, I'm going to provide a bit of background on the Risk Oversight and Governance Group of the CICA, our involvement with the not-for-profit community, and how we come to be bringing you these resources today to help boards of not-for-profit organizations. Risk Oversight and Governance is part of the Guidance and Support Group here at the CICA, and we work under the direction of an advisory board called the Risk Oversight and Governance Board, which is made up of business leaders from the community. We develop guidance material for boards of directors and senior management. One of the main ways that we do that is through the publication of a series of documents known as the 20 Questions series. These are publications targeted to boards of directors, and they focus on the role of the board by presenting questions that directors may ask about some of the important issues in their mandate. We then provide some suggestions against which they can compare the practices of their own organization. There are currently about 20 topics in the 20 Questions series, and some of those titles are up on the slide at the moment. While these documents are written primarily with public companies in mind, much of the content will also be relevant to not-for-profit organizations. We've also got a special series of documents designed for directors of nonprofits. These address the specific challenges that not-for-profit boards face. And to develop those documents, we work with an advisory group made up of leaders in the not-for-profit sector who volunteer the benefit of their expertise with us. So we're here today to discuss the newest document in our series, which is 20 Questions Directors of Not-for-Profit Organizations Should Ask About Board Recruitment, Development, and Assessment. We're very excited to bring you this publication as we know that this is a real challenge in the not-for-profit sector. We are very privileged to work with Richard LeBlanc, who's the lead author of this document and also one of the leading experts in Canada on board assessment, and I'll turn it over to him now. Thank you very much for joining us, Richard.
Great. Thanks very much, Beth. It's good to be here, everybody. First of all, I want to thank my co-author, who I believe is online right now, Hugh Lindsay in Vancouver, for his contribution, as well as the contribution of the various boards of the CICA. And the way that the process has worked is they've got several decades, if not centuries, of practical board experience and have critiqued the work to bring the document through to its final form. And I think what I'll do over the next 40 minutes or so is just sort of walk you through the various slides, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end. To begin with, I'm going to intend to walk through this from sort of cradle to grave, starting with recruitment, development, and then assessment. And in doing so, I will also address the issues particular to not-for-profits. And just to address this a little head-on with the second last bullet point of on this screen, the pushback really from not-for-profits is that we're not required to have assessment. This is changing globally now since the financial crisis, and I'll draw on some developments in the U.S., UK, South Africa, and Europe as they pertain to assessments and moving from an independence-based model to a competency-based model. I'm also going to address within the slides the volunteer status of directors, and the issue there is that, because we don't get paid for our position, that we really should not be assessing our performance. Let's just sort of put it bluntly. And my response to that, and this is in the document as well, is that not-for-profit directors serve for a variety of reasons, and indeed directors serve for a variety of reasons. And the fact that you're not paid doesn't mean that your fiduciary obligations and obligations as directors are no less significant. And lastly, the way that directors are appointed or elected to the board, we've incorporated within this document as well. And to some extent, really the for-profit sector can learn from the not-for-profit sector on electing and appointing directors to the board. And the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington right now is looking at proxy access, and in particular having a greater nexus between shareholders and the appointment of directors. And this is done very effectively in the not-for-profit sector, both on an appointed and an elected basis. So let's begin. I want to make a few remarks on the recruitment process. We are moving towards, from an independence-based model, particularly since the financial crisis, to a model based on knowledge, skills, and experience. And in particular, the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington is moving towards the disclosure of qualifications of individual directors for the first time. We've had this in Canada in the publicly traded sector since 2005, the requirement for a competency-based matrix for all publicly listed companies in Canada. And in addition, the United Kingdom, as of 3 months ago, its combined code is moving, and I'll read from the legislation. The board and its committees should, and this is new since December of 2009, the board and its committees should consist of directors with the appropriate balance of skills, experience, independence, and knowledge of the company to enable it to discharge its duties and responsibilities effectively. Essentially what we're seeing in the U.S. and UK and South Africa is an acknowledgement that independence in and of itself does not necessarily lead to better performance of the board and better performance for shareholders. So there's an explicit acknowledgement now in the last 3 or 4 months that I think is beginning to converge internationally on moving towards acknowledging that directors with the appropriate skills should be recruited and should be recruited on that basis. Third, the third bullet point, diversity. And again, here is where the not-for-profit sector is really leading the field. The figures are anywhere from 20 to 40% of diversity oriented directors on not-for-profit boards, whereas in the publicly traded sector, in Canada, for example, it's been said to be 9% and really hasn't changed much. So there is a significant trend right now globally in disclosure of diversity, and in some cases mandating diversity. The Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington has come out 3 months ago with, and this is significant, the requirement that all publicly traded companies in the U.S. on a go-forward basis have to disclose their diversity plans, both at the board level and at management level, to ensure that we have disclosure and scrutiny on how directors are recruited to the board. Australia has come out recently with something similar. France and Spain and the Netherlands have asked for, in fact, 40% women and other types of directors. So diversity really and renewal and diversification of boards is a significant trend that is actually being led by the not-for-profit sector. So the goal of recruitment really is to ensure a smooth transition of renewal so that you have a cross-section of directors with the skills and experiences at the board level. It's important to see recruitment in legislation, bylaws, and policies as something that is changeable. It certainly is possible to change legislation, to change bylaws and policies, and this is happening at my own university, for example, where we're progressing through acknowledging the need at the Senate level for diversification of directors and election and appointment to the board. Size and independence is an issue for not-for-profit boards, and what I'm finding in my external activities and research is that it's difficult without some form of renewal to limit the size of not-for-profit boards that tend to be fairly larger, and without some form of assessment of the performance of individual directors and the board to really focus on limiting the size of the board beyond 15 to 20, and in some cases more. So I'm seeing a trend in the not-for-profit sector for limiting the board size and really focusing on the skills and competencies of individual directors. The last point on this slide is mandates of the board, and I'll go to the next slide for that. It's important for not-for-profit, but all companies indeed to have mandates and to have disclosure of those mandates. And we've provided guidance within the document on best practices for mandates of the board. This slide here really doesn't do justice to what a board mandate should be and a committee mandate should be. So for all not-for-profit organizations, it's important that you have mandates, which is an explicit articulation of roles and responsibilities given your board and given your sector. And there certainly is the development of best practices in this area that are apparent for publicly traded companies. I had actually recommended to the Ontario Securities Commission that mandates be explicit and be disclosed for all publicly listed companies. So within 2 or 3 clicks of major corporations, now it's the case that you, as a shareholder or as any other stakeholder, should be able to determine what the mandates are for the individual board and for board committees. And that really focuses companies and boards and management teams on articulating and disclosing what their responsibilities should be. One caution in this regard is the development of mandates and how they relate to assessments. Oftentimes, the assessment is based on the mandate of the board. Do we achieve what we intend and set out to achieve? And if the management team or the advisor, and it tends to be a lawyer, craft a mandate in such a way that terms are used such as review or recommend or oversee that are not specific, the downside to that, and when I say specific, I mean specific in the sense of being rigorous and incorporating practices. When you in turn try to assess whether you fulfill the terms of the mandate, it becomes there is a lack of clarity. So I would advise boards really to oversee the development of these constating documents. The mandate for the board, the mandate for the compensation committee, the audit committee, the nominating committee, if you have those committees, and also the position descriptions for the individual board leaders, the chair of the board and the chair of each of these respective committees, to the point that they're specific, so that when you in turn down the track decide to assess based on the achievement of the mandate, there's clarity. For example, and I'll use risk as an example, if you say, for example, that and I've got it here, I think one of the bullet points, the appropriate oversight of risk identification and management, if you ask the board of directors, well, do we do this? The answer most of the time is yes, but if you have, and I'll read a few examples, an effective system to manage material risk, enterprise-wide, robust, dynamic, integrated into operations, aligned with risk appetite, culturally embedded, and effectively reported. That type of language is not typically included in a board mandate. Some of the better mandates out there include very specific language, and some of them are several pages in length. So the crafting of the mandate should be detailed and comprehensive and up to date, and should ideally have some sort of assurance providing mechanism by an outsider or certainly by the board in determining whether the mandate is appropriate for the organization. So many not-for-profit organizations and many small publicly traded companies and private companies do not have mandates. And this is an omission, because if you don't have a mandate, then you really aren't holding yourself responsible for what roles and responsibilities you should be fulfilling, and therefore it's very difficult to assess based on the achievement of the mandate. So my caution would be to have confidence, if you're a director, to really have a level of detail and rigor in the mandate to hold yourself responsible for achieving it. Those are board mandates. Committee charters, the similar words, committee mandates, or terms of reference for all intents and purposes. This slide really does not do justice to the comprehensiveness of mandates. For the Audit Committee, the Audit and Finance Committee, the Governance and Nominating Committee, and the Human Resources Committee, the three main committees, but there may be other committees as well. There may be fundraising committees, etc. Committee mandates are very important because that's where the work gets done. So these types of mandates should, again, in line with my previous remarks, be specific, detailed, comprehensive, and up-to-date. Position descriptions. Mandates are not sufficient because at the end of the day, individual directors have to fulfill their roles and responsibilities. And this is a unique Canadian requirement. Americans and directors in the UK do not have this requirement to have position descriptions. We do, which is essentially a job spec for individual board leaders. So the chairman of the board, chairperson of the board, should have a position description. And I've given you some bullet points here, and there's some guidance provided in the document. The chair of the committee, each of the principal board committees should have a position description as well. And individual directors should have position descriptions. And what flows from that, and really is, and I'll read from the legislation, the board should develop clear position descriptions for the chair of the board, the chair of each board committee. In addition, the board, together with the CEO, should develop a clear position description for the CEO, which includes delineating management's responsibilities. The board should also develop or approve corporate goals and objectives the CEO is responsible for meeting. And then, in turn, you're required, under the legislation, to assess based on the position description, and I'll read some of the legislation. The board, its committees, and each individual director should be regularly assessed regarding his, her, or its effectiveness and contribution. An assessment should consider, in the case of an individual director, the applicable position description, as well as the competencies and skills that the individual director is expected to bring to the board. So my point is that position descriptions are important because they determine whether individual directors are actually fulfilling their obligations. So you can have, for example, a risk committee or an audit committee, but if the chair of that committee and the individual directors aren't doing what they ought to be doing, then something will slip through the cracks. And if something slips through the cracks, it could be significant for the organization. And we've seen in the U.S. and other countries that have had financial institution collapses, it can be very significant. And the literature coming out of the financial crisis is that, and I'll read from some of the findings, failures in risk assessment and risk management were aggravated by the checks and balances of corporate governance failure. Many boards and senior management of financial firms neither understood the characteristics of the new highly complex financial products or were aware of the aggregate exposure of their companies. The point here is that position descriptions for chairs of committees are vitally important. And the individual director should be assessed based on the achievement of those position descriptions. And those position descriptions, in light of my previous remarks about board and committee mandates, should not be drafted at such a high level that it becomes easy to fulfill them. They should include the fulfillment of individual competencies and behaviors, which is what we'll talk about next. The competency matrix, I want to make a few remarks here. It's important when you're implementing this for not-for-profit boards, a few things. First of all, and I've got a series of competencies at the left, to have clarity among all of the directors. Let's say there's a board of 15 directors. You can't all possess all of the competencies and skills, but the competencies and skills should be two things. They should be appropriately defined so everybody understands what the competency actually is, because there are implications for that. If you restrict it, for example, to CEO, as opposed to, and I've listed here leadership experience, you're restricting individuals who may have leadership experience, such as women and direct reports to the CEO, that those competencies aren't being recognized. So there are implications for diversity. There are also implications for functional competencies as well, which I've listed here. So the competencies need to be well defined, and the scale of whether you've achieved these competencies and at what level needs to be well defined as well. So it's obvious to a director when they're filling out the competency matrix that what their level of proficiency is, whether it's a 1, a 2, a 3, 4, or a 5, or whatever scale you use, so that number one, you don't necessarily need to possess all competencies and skills, and it's obvious what level of skill acquisition you're at for an individual director. It could be the case, for example, if you have ambiguously defined competencies and an ambiguous scale, that individual directors rate themselves, and I see some of this raw data, at a very high level, including diversity, for example, if that's not appropriately defined, when they may not be at that level when you debrief with the nominating committee. And you might have female directors rating themselves lower, and I've had this experience as well, and male directors artificially rating themselves higher. So these systemic difficulties with the competency matrix can be overcome by a rigorous definition of what the competency is and why it's there, and also the appropriate scale. On implementing the competency matrix, it's important to have a very inclusive collegial process. So if and this really would be lodged with the governance and nominating committee of the board of directors, to have an inclusive. What industry are we in? What is our strategy? And irrespective of who's on the present board, what competencies and skills and experiences do we need for this board at this time? And then who of the incumbent directors possesses these competencies and skills? And ideally, this analysis should really drive your selection of incoming director. And there are implications for those directors that may not have the desired competencies and skills for the organization at this particular time. So this is a way of inwardly looking and taking ownership of competencies and skills by the nominating and governance committee. So the use of a skills matrix is very important. The personal qualities of effective directors are also very important. And these are road-tested competencies that are just vitally important, because at a board level, when something goes wrong or directors are not performing, it tends to be not whether the director is independent or not necessarily, but whether how that person's competencies and behaviors get manifested in the boardroom. So courage, for example, was mentioned in the UK. They asked Sir David Walker, who came out with a report about 3 months ago on corporate governance in the United Kingdom, what are the two thrusts of this report? And he said competency and courage, having the ability to push back against management at a board level. So these subjective qualities, for example, my remarks earlier about defining them and assessing them should come out. I mean, I've done peer reviews of individual boards where I use these exact qualities. And some of the best boards in Canada have come to me and said, well, Richard, we want you to push us to what, according to your studies and your research, as to what qualities you think we should have. So these types of qualities are vital, and they will determine whether the board ultimately is effective or ineffective, including on an individual director level. Behavioral skills of directors. And those sophisticated directors and managers in the audience will look at these items here and they will resonate with people. How to ask a question properly and incite. And some of the best directors really are effective at conflict resolution, flexibility, how to ask the question, how to drill down in a collegial way. Chair qualities, being an effective communicator, setting the strategic vision, being able to set appropriate priorities in real time at a board meeting, how to use power effectively and take charge when necessary. So what we've done, my co-author and I, is we've set these various competencies and skills within the document because they contribute to ultimately whether the person will be effective or not. Conducting the selection process. In the document, we've articulated how the competency matrix should drive the selection of profile for incoming director, and we've offered a number of suggestions on how directors can be brought onto the board. The advantage of the competency matrix, really, is the first bullet point, is that it equalizes the playing field. So it's possible to have, people who you know or people who are recommended to you in the second, third, fourth bullet points, providing, of course, that they meet the competency matrix. But what it should not be, which typically is the case, is a very informal dialogue on, do we know someone? Those days are and should be over. And the level of rigor now that is being scrutinized by shareholders, and this will absolutely increase. Shareholders will want to know, how did these directors, in fact, I'm seeing convergence internationally on shareholders actually not only wanting to know, but wanting direct input into some of these selection processes. And again, we can look to the not-for-profit sector for guidance in this respect, because I think they do this quite well. When you're recruiting, information packages are vital. So you're actually selling the position to a prospective director. So to the extent that you can put together a package including the vision, the mandates, the programs, the activities of the board, this is a good thing. Other things you might want to include are role descriptions, terms of service, limits, renewals, time commitments, and some not-for-profit organizations may not have all of these articulated, but to the extent that you can put them together and put pen to paper, it adds to contributing to the expectations. So if I'm a prospective director coming onto a board, a not-for-profit board of XYZ, I know exactly what the time commitments are, what my expectations are, why I'm there, how I'm going to be evaluated, why I'm being brought onto the board. Orientation and development. We've articulated a number of best practices in this area. The UK, again, is leading the field on the ability of a director to get outside assistance. And South Africa is also saying, and this applies to not-for-profit organizations, the King report, that you should have an ability as a director, if you need education on a particular topic or on a risk, in moving from gross risk to residual risk, to get that assistance. And management should not curtail that by limiting that in any way, including funding. If the funds are available, and most times they are, your ability as a chair of a board or chair of an individual committee or an individual director to get education on these types of topics, particularly if you're not from the sector, should not be curtailed. And indeed, it should be in the charter. The retention of outside advisors and assurance providers should be explicit and in the committee charter and in the board charter. So you as a board have that, and as an individual director and board leader, should have that responsibility articulated in the charter. And in fact, South Africa has come out with a combined assurance model for the audit committee, so that if you're, and this I think will permeate into other jurisdictions and not-for-profits as well, you have an ability, you should have an ability, sitting on the audit committee, for any risk that you're not satisfied with, to have an external assurance provider provide assurance on the design and implementation and effectiveness of the internal controls over that particular risk. And that provides tension to management to really cover their bases, so that you don't have, and I see this in the not-for-profit boards that I'm working with, where the CEO and the management team says, well, and I'm paraphrasing, but trust us, we're doing this effectively. And this is, and all not-for-profits have risk. These are very significant risks. So then the committee and the directors come to me and say, well, Richard, what should we, and my advice at that point is, you need really to push back on management and say, not only do we want risk assurance from internal audit and from the chief risk officer or the risk function, but we should have an ability, if we're not satisfied with that management attestation, to go outside of the company. And I'm not suggesting that boards do that necessarily, but there should be an effective risk mitigation process in place so that you have management and internal assurance providers, and if necessary, your residual authority to have external assurance provided. So that covers off orientation and education. We're now going to move towards the assessment of boards in the next 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. Governance assessment. Many boards currently assess their board, its practices, and its members informally by a variety of means. It was the case in the publicly traded sector that largely assessments were not done on a rigorous basis. Now they are commonplace, and many boards have a variety of models that they've put together. And one of the purposes of this document is really to bring these types of best practices into the not-for-profit sector and to the Crown sector as well. It's important to have a formal assessment process, and I'm going to go through over the next series of slides a menu, really, a best practice menu of what types of approaches and criteria you should be using or consider using for these governance assessments. And when I say governance assessment, I really mean a broad assessment of the board, the committees, and the individual directors. Before you start, it's important to ask, the two questions really are, who will be assessed, by whom, and how will that data be managed? These types of assessments are sensitive because you're asking about performance. So you really need performance metrics, and you need, as a board, to buy into the assessment process. What gets assessed and by whom? Now let's talk about what I'm seeing globally right now. I'm seeing in the movement towards external assessment providers. And this might be reaching ahead in the next 2, 3, 4 years, but I think it's important to give a best practice and a global framework. The UK, for example, came out 3 months ago, and they've said we want every 2 to 3 years for all publicly listed companies in the UK to go outside the company for a governance assessment. And the rationale for that is really that if you do it internally, if you assume, for the sake of argument, and I think this is accurate, that boards have no arms and legs, they really don't do the assessments. Management contributes to the assessment, and oftentimes management does the assessment. Well, that's problematic because the management is accountable to the board, but management is assessing on behalf of the board the effectiveness of the board. So the Institute of and that's a conflict, and it's also misguided accountability. So my point is that directors of not-for-profit organizations and governance, and really the governance committee of the board, has to step up and say, this is something that we should consider doing, that we need to do. We're not going to necessarily farm it out to management. Management can assist in the administration of the assessment, but it's really up to the governance committee of the board to drive the assessment. And that means that you need to think about what you're assessing and how you're assessing it and how you're going to provide feedback based on that assessment. So I would caution the learnings of publicly listed companies of necessarily having management drive the ship, but at the same time acknowledge that the board really has limited resources and time and the advantages of external participation in that assessment. Part of the reason for using external participation is to have a second set of eyes, to have expertise brought in from the outside. So it's important at the very front end of the assessment for the board as a whole to have ownership of it and understand why it's occurring and how it should occur. And some of the issues are a chair not wanting the assessment done, or certain directors trying to push back and not have the assessment done. So I've seen situations where boards have been somewhat fractured because the majority of the directors would want an assessment, but a key director or the chair of the board did not want the assessment, and I'll address that in the next series of slides. There are types and combinations of assessments: board, committee, board and committee chairs, and individual directors. And these are interdependent. It's possible, for example, to assess all of these all at once in an omnibus assessment. It's possible to assess the board 1 year, committees another year, and then individual directors in year 3. So there's no set model, and companies are using various forms. I would say that to do all of these in 1 year really is a big ask. I think you should stagger them and have assessment cycles. And I'll get to best practices in assessment cycles a little later on. You're also assessing roles and responsibilities of the board, individual directors, and as I said earlier, the governance committee really should be driving the bus on this. The assessment of the board and the committees and individual directors should rest firmly and unambiguously with the governance committee. How do you do the assessment? Well, the models out there are interviews, either external or internal, and questionnaires. And the questionnaires, the advantage of the questionnaires, if they're done properly, is that they can really yield some good, powerful, objective, robust data. The advantage of the interviews is that stuff that's not said in the questionnaires can get said in the interviews. The disadvantage of the interviews is that it could tend to be very high level and not really having objective data. The best combination is actually interviews and questionnaires, because you get the rigor of the questionnaires and then you get the subjective look and feel of the interviews. Although you can have interviews with the chair of a governance committee that are really hard-hitting and tough. So a lot of the interviews depends on the effectiveness of the external advisor or the effectiveness of the chair of the governance committee. We recommend, and this is consistent with the literature and best practice, that the chair of the board should not be the person conducting the interviews or driving the board assessment. It really should be the chair of the governance committee on behalf of the governance committee. And that's for the simple reason that if you have an ineffective board, you will quite likely have an ineffective chair. So chairs that really are reluctant to support a board assessment, I've noticed in my work that there is probably a relationship between the reluctance to assess the board on behalf of the chair and the actual effectiveness of the chair. So that in order to get around that conflict, the chair of the governance committee really should be assessing the board on behalf of the committee, and also that should include the assessment of the chair of the board. So issues are objectivity, confidentiality, how to design the questions. It's difficult to achieve confidentiality with the board if you're using a paper-based questionnaire, or and if you're submitting your questionnaires to management, because your handwriting could be recognized. You're reluctant to be, completely candid and critical because it's on paper and it's, it could be used to identify a particular. You're really putting a lot of faith in management and in the corporate secretary or the general counsel to really be a key confidant and to maintain confidences. And I've seen that done well. It can happen. I said earlier about assessing the mandates of the board. These sorts of things are not always in mandates: relationships, dynamics, procedures, resources, leadership, etc. So it's important not necessarily only to look at the roles and responsibilities within the mandate when assessing the board and the committees, but also some of the subjective, softer qualities that are equally as impactful, such as leadership skills, whether resources are being brought to bear, management reporting, relationships, dynamics. These sorts of things are very, very, very important and should be part of each assessment. Assessing individual directors. This is a tough thing to do. And again, my remarks about position descriptions are apt here. It's also the contribution of skills and experiences that you were recruited for: financial, legal, project management, etc., and qualities and behaviors, the ability to present opinions, ask questions, resolve conflict. This can be done quite well, both on a self level, a peer level, and a board level. And I've assisted in some of these where you've got your self score, your peer score, which is what your peers think of you, and there's a gap there between what you think of how effective you are at these various dimensions, how effective your peers think you are, and then what the board average is. So it's possible to have a gap analysis and really have some insightful feedback on performance on an individual level. This performance on an individual level, I'm in the top half of the screen right now, and I'll move to chairs in a second. This performance on an individual level is very instructive because it tells you how your colleagues see you. And peak performing directors really want that feedback because they want to know how they can nuance their approach, and it's done in a confidential basis. They see only their own reporting. The same consideration should apply to chairs. So the chair of the governance committee, the chair of the audit committee, and the chair of the compensation committee should be assessed by these respective individual committee members. Some of these chairs of these three committees should also be assessed by people who don't sit on that committee, who can assess how effective these chairs are at reporting to the full board. So to pick an example, the chair of the audit committee should be assessed on audit committee specific roles and responsibilities by all of the audit committee members. And that chair of the audit committee should also be assessed by non-audit committee members based on certain criteria. The chair of the board should also be assessed by all of the other directors. That's what I mean when I talk about assessing individual chairs. Assessment follow-through. I had done a study, I guess it was about a year or two ago, for a government, and they asked me to take a look at all of their assessment practices and how they could improve them. So I ended up interviewing the chairs of the boards and the chairs of the various governance committees, and the feedback was very clear and almost unanimous that, Richard, you need to recommend to the government the follow-through. We've got all these best practices done for the assessment, but if we don't follow through on implementing the assessment, then we're really at a loss because we're not achieving the full value of the assessment. So I had recommended at the time, and I'm recommending here, that we really have follow-through. And I mentioned, Hugh, my co-author, and I mentioned in the document to have in-camera sessions at the committee level and also at the board level. And by in-camera, I mean that you kick management out of the room and you talk about the results of the assessment and how to move it forward at the committee level and at the board level. And also at the individual director level, you need to follow through. I said earlier that the individual director gets his or her results, self, peer, and board, but that's not enough. You actually need to have a sit-down, and here's where the chair of the board comes in. You have a sit-down with the chair of the board on the results of your assessment and how to move that forward. And that could be sculpting out a education plan for you, additional education, mentoring, advice on an informal basis, talking about some of the issues, but you need that feedback between receiving the individual performance appraisal as an individual director and also sitting down with the chair to discuss that appraisal. And that appraisal might be, depending on the nature of the appraisal, maybe it's time to step down from the board. And I'm saying this in a worst-case scenario, but these situations happen where the director, it's obvious to the director that they either step up their game or they change, or they decide that they're, for one reason or another, that they don't wish to continue, or they're counseled off of the board. So part of the advantage of doing an individual director assessment is it brings a level of objectivity and rigor to the chair of the board to be able to counsel out a non-performing director. And I'm saying this, in a minority of cases, but these cases do happen because when you bring people onto the board, you necessarily have to bring people off of the board. So this brings a level of objectivity and independence to the process. So the point of this screen really is to have feedback once the assessment occurs at the board level, the committee level, and individual director level to move that agenda forward. And the role really of the governance committee on the feedback and the moving it forward is to hold fellow directors accountable. So the governance committee really should be the repository of the feedback and the follow-through. And the follow-through should actually feed back into the appraisal of the chair of the board and the chair of each of the committees a year or two later. So a year or two later, you should really hold those directors responsible for implementing the reforms based on the board, the committee, and the assessment of the individuals. So what you do is you parcel out the feedback and you parcel out the implementation, and then you hold, as a director on the governance committee and the chair of the governance committee, you hold these respective directors accountable for implementing the results in their next performance appraisal. So it all sort of is integrated and fits together. That's the purpose of the follow-through, and that's vital right now. And that's a key weakness I see in the governance assessment process. And we've spent one or two questions in the 20-question document dealing with the follow-through. As I said earlier, I won't spend a lot of time on this slide. Providing feedback to directors, meeting with the chair to discuss the results, developing a plan for improvement, factoring it into the renomination process, which is what I mentioned earlier. Providing feedback to chairs. The chairs of the committees should get feedback from the chair of the board, and the chair of the board should get feedback by the chair of the governance committee. Let's go to the next slide in the interest of time. Opportunities for improvement. I've listed here, and there are only 6 or 7, but I've seen all types of permutations and combinations of improvement, because it's sort of like garbage in, garbage out. If you have a really robust assessment at the board level, committee level, or individual director level, you're going to get a host of suggestions for improvement. So there certainly is no shortage of opportunities for implementing the results of a rigorous and robust assessment. And there's 2 bullet points at the bottom, arrows, that don't try to do everything and just pick and choose what are the most important and prioritize, and then develop a plan and follow up. Dealing with an underperforming director, we've addressed earlier. This is really tough to do, particularly when the director doesn't know they're underperforming or knows they're underperforming for a variety of reasons and doesn't want to improve. Part of the advantage of an assessment is it provides an impetus and a stick, if you will, on counseling out a non-performing director off of the board. And that non-performing director, by the way, could be the chair of the board or a chair of a key board committee. So I'll move off of this slide in the interest of time because we want to get to questions. I think we've got 1 or 2 slides left, Beth. Options for the assessment cycle. And again, these are options that I've seen and in some cases participated in. I think it's important as a board to understand that Rome wasn't built in a day. We need to walk before we can run, and we need to sculpt out a path. And I can give an example. This governance study that I did earlier, where I had recommended to the government that all of the companies do a board assessment in year 1, including the assessment of the chair of the board. And in year 2, they assess all of the committees of the board. And in year 3, they assess the individual directors. So once every 3 years, you're really doing a full board assessment, you're doing all the committees, and you're doing the individual directors. This is but one example. You could, for example, have a very robust board assessment in the first year and then have a temperature check in the second year. You could have a board assessment that includes committee assessments. There are various permutations and combinations. The point here is that it needs to work for the individual board and for the individual directors, and there's no one-size-fits-all model. So on that point, I will turn it over to Beth, and we'll see if we have any questions that have come in, and I presume that there have been many.
That was wonderful, Richard. Thank you very much. We're going to move into our question and answer segment now. We've got some questions in, but you can continue to submit now. If you haven't already, you can just use the Ask a Question feature that's at the bottom of your screen. The first question we've got is from someone who indicates that they're a member of the board of a very small not-for-profit organization and have not in the past done a board assessment, and that some of the directors on the board are hesitant to get involved in the process. And do you have any suggestions to help ease them into it and get buy-in from the directors?
Sure. I would not recommend assessing individual directors right out of the starting gate. If this particular board has limited experience with assessments generally, I might suggest starting with a board assessment in a way that's palatable to them and attempts to persuade directors that this is best practice. Plenty of boards have done it in Canada, and they've received very positive results. Shareholders and our members expect us to hold ourselves accountable. It's the right thing to do, but I would not start with a director assessment right out of the starting gate. In fact, I think on average you'd want to spend 2 or 3 years with some solid assessment results under your belt before you move to the assessment of individual directors, just so people have a comfort level.
Thank you, Richard. The next question we've got indicates that many not-for-profit boards may not, in fact, have a standing governance committee. Well, they may have finance or audit, they may have an HR committee, and governance may be addressed by the board as a whole. In boards that are set up that way, who should be responsible for the governance assessment process?
The question is, we don't have a governance committee. We might have other types of committees, but we don't have a governance committee. So therefore, how do we move forward the governance assessment? I would say that the chair and CEO should not be doing the assessment, but you want a trusted director on the board with the trustworthiness, the credibility, the experience, the softer skills to be able to administer and lead the governance assessment, who's trusted by directors and who can deal with sensitive issues. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the governance committee. It can be 1 or 2 directors on the board that has the buy-in by other directors to move that assessment forward. That was in response to Jonathan's question.
Thank you.
There's a question from Patrick. Who should be given the responsibility of creating up-to-date mandates that will serve to guide each board and committee, especially if it's the centerpiece of how directors are assessed, whether they have fulfilled their fiduciary roles? The question here is from Patrick. Who should craft the mandates? The board, it is possible, if I'm sitting on a board, to actually craft a mandate. It's not as hard as people think. There are plenty of good best practice examples out there. I've crafted mandates as well, and so have others. So it's possible for the board to craft the mandate. I wouldn't think that the board should necessarily delegate that authority to management without some sort of oversight, or to an outside participant, an outside lawyer, for example. There was a not-for-profit situation I was involved in recently where the CEO had crafted all of the mandates. And that was obvious to me that the mandates were crafted in such a way that there's a natural tendency for management to be self-interested in crafting of the mandate. So I think that directors really should oversee, that's the important point, the crafting of the mandates in a fairly rigorous way.
Thank you, Richard. We've got a question from someone who indicates that it's hard enough to recruit talented, unpaid board members for nonprofits without imposing a complex board assessment process. Is there a middle ground or a light version? And I think this really addresses the reality of a lot of the smaller not-for-profits. I know you spoke earlier to some boards that have a challenge with large boards and the need to use performance assessments to help decide which directors should remain on the board and ensure that they're performing. But the flip side is, I think, a lot of not-for-profit boards who really struggle to get any directors at all. And if they've got people on the board, and if they've got some of the skill sets they're looking for, I think are reluctant to look like they're then criticizing those members. So do you have any suggestions for some of the smaller organizations?
Yeah, you can do a competency matrix on the back of a napkin. You just need to have some leadership on the board level and I'm not suggesting that you have an omnibus complex process that a large sophisticated organization might implement, but that you start somewhere. So having informal processes is a good first step, but imposing some level of rigor, which could be a 1 or 2 page matrix that you circulate among all the directors. What skills do we need going forward, and do you have suggestions for prospective directors that would possess some of these skills? Part of the advantage of looking inward is really a do-it-yourself sort of model. So you can always start softly, start small, take baby steps, and then move forward. Okay. Other questions?
Yes. We've got one that I think is an issue for a lot of boards. In the area of fundraising, which is often a major expectation on a board, how does that function? How does that factor into the assessment of a director?
Well, directors that are prospective donors and fundraisers that are brought onto the board are still have fiduciary responsibilities as directors. So there's a disconnect. There's a inherent conflict between representing the interests of a particular stakeholder or a donor versus that of the organization. So it's possible to have operating responsibilities on a not-for-profit board, particularly some of the smaller boards, but at the same time realize that you don't want to be in a situation where you're critiquing your own work. So all directors are held to the same fiduciary standard of care, including those directors that are brought on representing particular stakeholders or having specific responsibilities. I would suggest that if you are admitting directors with fundraising obligations, that you make that explicit before they come onto the board, that these are your expectations so far as fundraising is concerned. And at the same time have within your mandates and your assessment process an acknowledgement that there's an inherent operational conflict between participating in these sorts of activities and being responsible as a fiduciary for the entire organization, and having a program of development for those directors that may be brought onto the board purely for fundraising skills, where they develop other competencies and governance-related skills and can act on behalf of the organization.
Thank you, Richard. Another question that applies to a lot of smaller organizations, a lot of organizations in general these days. In an era of reduced funding, if there aren't funds available to bring in, for example, outside experts, how do we prioritize and make governance education a priority?
Yeah, I'm looking at this question from John, and especially in the healthcare business. You know, the Ontario Hospital Association has done an excellent job of providing guidance. They've come out with a second document now as an example of not-for-profit leadership, and they've got a great website, the OHA. It's possible. You don't need to fund speakers or to education levels educators to come in and give best practice advice to a board. They want to do this. Generally, I do it because I have a public policy mandate, but lawyers and accountants and others will, if you're a not-for-profit organization and you want to bring in external speakers or assistants, you don't necessarily have to pay them. Many times for goodwill and for reputational and profile purposes, they want to participate because they see it as prospective business development, client development down the track. So not all, and I wanted to mention this earlier, I'm glad this question came up, not all orientation and education necessarily needs to be paid for. It can be done pro bono, and certainly firms encourage this, and the university encourages it as well. So it's a very good idea. You don't necessarily have to possess funds to develop your directors.
And the one thing I would add to that, Richard, as well, is that you can probably do quite a bit of your director development, not necessarily with a live person in the room, but through resources. I mean, there's webinars like this one. Imagine Canada also has a series of low-cost webinars and training events. There's some links on our website to organizations that provide kind of free and low-cost resources. So it doesn't necessarily mean a big retreat and people coming in. If you identify specific areas that you want to increase the competencies of your board members, you may well be able to find sort of lower cost or lower tech ways of doing that.
Okay, good.
All right, our next question said, for not-for-profit boards, what proportion of time should be spent on risk assessment and management? And they're talking about a small organization with only 3 staff members.
Risk now is important, and it needs to be part of a dialogue on a ongoing basis. You should receive, any organization, not-for-profit, Crown, or publicly traded, or private, should receive at least once a year, I would say twice, some form of comprehensive board report on how risk is handled in that organization, including the design and effectiveness of internal controls for those material business risks, because every organization has risks, because I think it's an omission if you don't have risk reporting. It doesn't necessarily need to be, a Cadillac model, but it needs to be some dialogue at a board level about risk, and as well the flip side of risk, which is opportunity.
Okay, thank you. We've probably got time for about one more question.
Sure.
We have a question here asking if you have any modifications or additions to your recommendations where the board involves the working board, so it's closely involved in operations.
Yeah, this was mentioned in the not-for-profit document as well about the conflict, I call it, that of an operating board. There's nothing wrong with an operating board, but there is an inherent conflict because you ultimately need to be disconnected and assess the effectiveness of operations. So there's an inherent conflict. So as long as you can cope with that conflict, and that could involve either leaving the room or having other directors participate in the assessment of operations, if you have an operating role as a director, then that generally is taken care of. And I realize in not-for-profit corporations, it's inevitable that you will have conflicts. Conflicts are there, they just need to be managed, and they fundamentally, and this is the important point, they need to be acknowledged.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. That was an excellent presentation and great answers to those questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but we are running out of time. So for more information or to download PDFs of any of the CICA documents, you can visit our website. And the other thing there is if you want to hear more from Richard, or from myself for that matter, there's also a link there to the Canadian Society of Corporate Secretaries Annual Corporate Governance Conference. It's going to be held in August of this year. Richard will be there giving a great overview of developments in governance, and there are specific sections on the program tailored to the needs of not-for-profit organizations. So just to remind you all, check the resources section within your registration link to access the slides, the evaluation, and the CPD quiz. You will not receive the standard email after the session because everything you need is in there under resources. So that concludes today's webinar. Thank you, Richard. And
thank you to
everyone for participating.
It was a pleasure to be here, everybody. I hope it was useful. Thank you very much.